Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Shoo! Woohoo! Suey! Hey, my little piggy! Well, success for David Cameron's trade mission to China this week. Downing Street announced that the UK has won the right to export pig semen to China. This is going to be a long one. In a deal worth £45 million per year. Little piggies. That'll rescue Britain's economy for sure. In exchange, it appears China will win the rights to more of the UK's real income-producing assets, such as the HS2 high-speed rail link between London and those places up north that nobody ever goes to. Not only will China invest in the new rail network, but may even build it. They did a good job in America building the railroads. Cameron bragged that the UK infrastructure is worth investing in, not just by the government. Meanwhile, back in the UK, a spate of frightening clown stalking continues. Police told members of the public to ignore people dressed as clowns if they meet them in the street. Alas, despite the public warning, the media insisted on reporting on George Osborne's autumn statement. Ha ha! Stacy!
Max, George Osborne, perhaps the most terrifying clown of all. Actually, you want to take a look at this image here. This is a clown spotted in Norfolk. I'm not sure if it was George Osborne, but he looked quite similar with his autumn statement. Now, one thing that was reporting on the state of the UK economy, I think, was the UK gilt. Because in the March budget, 10-year gilts were trading at 1.8%. With the autumn statement, is now at 2.92%. So let's look at some of the lies that he had to tell in order to make the economy here look better. Well, workers' overall pay has not fallen, insists George Osborne. George Osborne is to claim that workers' overall pay has not fallen, despite official figures showing that the wages of middle-income families have dropped by £5,000 over the past 5 years. So that's a drop of 6.4%, according to the Office of National Statistics. George Osborne is saying those are a lie. He's going to come out with his own report to show that, in fact, those numbers are deceptive.
Yeah, George Osborne, he's not so much a clown as he is one of these French mimes. And, but he speaks, which is kind of interesting for a mime. He's more of a pantomime. It's a pantomime show. And he believes that these numbers do not tell the truth. He's like Henri Magritte, the famous French artist who would say that ça n'est pas un pipe, as a painting of a pipe. This is not a pipe. According to George Osborne, this ce n'est pas un table. Ce n'est pas un table. C'est quelque chose, je ne sais pas. Je suis George Osborne, un mime français très connu. Oui, d'accord. You see? It's not anything, it's not real, according to George Osborne. People aren't suffering. They're not suffering in this country. They're merely expressing their patriotic fervor for the coalition government. They're not starving. They're not freezing to death. They're merely expressing their patriotism.
Well, he does look a bit porcine, you might say, so he could be more.
Yeah, he's a big fat pig, let's be honest about it, and so is his brother-in-arms, David Cameron.
With David Cameron and his...
Here's David Cameron at the, this is my impression of David Cameron at one of these big, tough dinners, you know, he's like, hi, I'm David Cameron. So anyway, the poor people in this country, we don't really, we gotta do something about the poor people. Yeah, he's a big mafioso, no good Nick, isn't he?
Well, let's look at those who aren't so porcine, and this is the people who can't even afford to eat. This is looking at the true state of the British economy. Now, George Osborne, as we said, he likes to deny the statistics, deny the actual facts, but tweet from The Independent reads, experts said government may be covering up how austerity and welfare cuts are adding to food crisis. Hunger in Britain has reached the level of a, quote, public health emergency, and the government may be covering up the extent to which austerity and welfare cuts are adding to the problem, leading experts have said. This is from the British Medical Journal, and they spoke to a group of doctors, senior academics, and two leading universities.
Well, the way to calculate GDP in this country is how many people they're killing. So it's really debt per death, or a GT per death. So there'll be fuel poverty this winter, meaning people will die like they did last winter, and that will add to the GDP. So when Osborne talks about GDP growth, he's just shoveling dead bodies into the furnace. Yeah, we love dead bodies. It helps our GDP growth. Yeah, whoopee!
So the report by these doctors and the university says that a surge in the number of people requiring emergency food aid, a decrease in the amount of calories consumed by British families, and a doubling of the number of malnutrition cases seen at English hospitals represent all the signs of a public health emergency that could go unrecognized until it is too late to take preventative action, they write. Again, one of the things that they say is most important is the rise in malnutrition in English hospitals they're seeing. So there's 5,500 cases in the last year, up from about 3,000 at the beginning of the crisis. So once you deprive a child of the nutrients they require to develop their brain and their capacity, well, now you're just writing off the future generation.
They're not malnourished. They're not starving to death. They're expressing their patriotic fervor.
Well, perhaps that's what George Osborne will say, because they did commission a report. The government looked into it. They're delaying it. They've had the results for several months. They're saying they're delaying it because they're not quite happy with some of the facts revealed in their own report. So they want to make sure that they were rigorous and diligent in finding the right information.
Yeah, it's the Soviet Union. Played out here in Britain. So I remember the Soviet Union famously would say, oh, we've got all these tractors rolling off the assembly line, and the average potato farmer is making 10 times more kilos. And, you know, there would be this huge propaganda organ to misinform the public. So here's George Osborne doing his best Stalin impression, saying, oh, yes, the malnutrition is good for the nation, and there is no reduction in living standards, and austerity is fantastic, and we're going to beat whoever it is we're fighting against. We're not sure, but the Chinese give us a lot of money, and Boris Johnson thinks that the reason poor people are poor is because they're stupid, and we're down with that because we're funky. We're down at number 11, number 10 Downing Street. Come and see us. We got a show every 2 and 4 hours. We're the Osborne and Cameron frickin' Pantomime.
So, as I said, that the future generation is being deprived of nutrients, but they're also being deprived of the nutrients of savings. This is in the next headline, Max. Biggest drop in savings for 40 years, Bank of England figures reveal. The bank figures show £23 billion taken out of long-term savings in the past 12 months, equivalent to £900 for every household. Now, they spoke to Ross Altman, a former Downing Street advisor, and she told the Telegraph, quote, the figures are desperately worrying. People are stopping saving for the long term because all the policies of the last few years mean you would be a mug to save.
Well, their savings are in pig semen in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, how do they collect all that pig semen to export to China anyway, unless it's Osborne is collecting the semen himself? I mean, he's down at the farm, you know, pleasuring pigs all day long. Shouldn't he be over there doing something more useful than pig pleasuring so he can export the semen to China? You would think this guy had a real job. Maybe he likes that job. Maybe that's why he took the job.
It is all being collected here. They're not sending any live pigs to China. Now, interestingly, apparently the pigs here have better genetic material, and it goes with that whole eugenics concept that you brought up with Boris Johnson, saying that the reason why people are poor are because they have low IQs, which is the classic eugenicist idea that came out back in the 30s and 40s.
Well, you know, there's a combination of two things here. First of all, the pigs here, you know, they're a cheap date. So they're able to collect semen a lot cheaper than they would as some of these high-priced pigs down in the Côte d'Azur in France, for example. Mm-hmm. And as you point out, it is an example of what Boris Johnson spoke about. The reason that poor people in the UK are poor is because they're stupid. That is an example of eugenics. So here you've got the pig eugenics and the pig semen mixed with Boris Johnson, the pig who sits behind me in that gonad-looking building, who's talking about eugenics in the country and saying, look, we need to implement eugenics to weed out the stupid people. That's what Boris Johnson's saying. Let's weed out the stupid people.
Well, it comes around during times of Great Depression. We're in a Great Depression. Back then they were in a Great Depression, and the people who caused the Great Depression tend to be the fraudsters, the banksters, and they tend to be hoarding the wealth at the top, and they don't like to look at themselves, so they try to think of some other reason. Well, those people are stupid because we've deprived them of food while they were growing and nutrients while they were growing, and we've deprived them of savings, and now we're going to have to retire at 70 years old. So, you know, those people are stupid for even listening to us. But finally, we're going to go to where this is all leading. As boomers retire, will all be Detroiters soon. So Detroit is allowed to move forward with their bankruptcy. And on the chopping block, of course, is all those obligations to the former workers and present workers. Analysts have warned for years about the massive underfunding of public pensions. The Detroit bankruptcy will test whether governments can cut back on promises made years, even decades earlier. Make no mistake, other cities are watching the proceedings. I'm talking about you, Philadelphia.
Oh, this is, of course, a more scapegoating of the poor. So the workers worked their lives for their pension account. There's cash that can be used to leverage all kinds of synthetic obligations on Wall Street. So that money has to be stolen. Clearly, whether you're in the UK or Detroit, whether you're in Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, or Detroit, your pensions are up for grabs from the shysters on Wall Street, led by the shysters on number 10 and number 11 of Boris Johnson. They want to take your money and they want to turn it into all kinds of flora and fauna derivatives, spinning the globe, giving them income for doing nothing. That's the way it does.
And there's very much a lot of mainstream media propaganda against the workers here, that they are somehow, they're the ones that drove this city into the ground. Not any of the derivatives and the interest rate swaps and all the crazy bank dealings that happened over the last few years, or the collapse of the auto industry. A lot to do with tax policy and shipping jobs to China, where we're now only sending them pig semen in return. Well, it goes to the whole nation and therefore the world after this. Detroit's pension woes, however, highlight a bigger challenge. The U.S. hasn't saved enough to support the coming retirement of millions of baby boomers. In a sense, we are all Detroiters. Now, George Osborne has said that here in the UK, anybody 50 and over is safe. We're not going to cut anything from your pensions, and you can retire at 65 and stay healthy and enjoy some years of retirement. It's just all the suckers under 50. We're going to abuse them, make them work, make them take out huge amounts of debts to finance a university, and they're going to work until they're 70. We'll probably raise it to 75 or 80 if they happen to live that long.
What a putz. We gotta go. We gotta go, Stacy.
Time to move on.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I am Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Professor Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. Steve Keen, welcome back.
Great to be here, mate. Love your backdrop.
You're on the whirlwind tour, of course, debunking economics all over the world. What about George Osborne? Let's spend some time debunking George Osborne. He's not an economist, but he still managed to run the UK economy into the ground. The Office of National Statistics says middle-income household income in the UK is down £5,000 since 2008. Your thoughts?
Politicians believe what they think of the experts, because all they want to have is little numbers they can quote and say in front of the TV, it's all going to be wonderful in the future. And they end up being suckers for an economic discipline that has no idea of how the economy operates, didn't see this crisis coming, and their advice has actually made it worse. And the trouble is Osborne is following that advice. So it's driven the economy down, and the only way you can see up is by causing another housing bubble, which is where, what I call, they call it help to buy, I call it help to sell, has turned up. So you've got another property bubble, another asset speculation revival going on here. That's about as far as they've got, and it's running out of steam, as we can all see right now, and the real economy is continuing to tank. So we need to get rid of what I call the politico-financial complex. It's not the military-industrial complex that screwed up capitalism, which was Eisenhower's thoughts 40 years ago. It's the financial-politico complex, and that's where most of our problems come from. So they're making a bad situation worse. Right, so the action on the ground, people are suffering from fuel poverty, they're freezing to death, they are malnourished in this country. Rates of malnourishment are now at, decade high levels. But those numbers never seem to factor into the chancellor's equations in terms of how the economy is doing. It's almost as if they're scapegoating the poor. As a matter of fact, Boris Johnson, the mayor here in London, has recently said that the reason the poor are poor is because they're stupid.
And it sounds like eugenics almost. Is Osborne and these guys, are they back to the eugenics policies?
It feels
of the...
that way. I mean, the classic thing is when you look at the research behind eugenics, which goes back to a guy called Sir Cyril Burt 50, 60, 70 years ago, that was as flaky as economic research. He actually did that whole thing, you know. So you mentioned the upper class would have an average IQ of 120, 100 for the middle class and 80 for the working class. And he did, I suppose, like a twin study to support it. We then found out he made up about 70 of his 100 twins. It was all fraud, like almost everything else. And the reality is social structures lock talented people at the bottom of the system and make an incredible struggle to get up. And you get the upper class toffs who aren't necessarily all that bright, get their, you know, trip from PPE to running Westminster. It isn't brains.
Yeah, it's interesting around
class.
Culturally speaking. The poor have had different ways to break through the ceiling, the artificial ceiling. In America, you know, you have sports as a way, you know, basketball, for example, has been a way for black Americans to break through the oppression of racism and financial degradation. In Canada, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Canada.
It's
hockey. Well, ice hockey and comedy to some degree.
Yeah.
Here in the UK, you've got rock and roll. The music.
What
is
can
always...
a boy do, poor boy do, but to play in a rock roll band?
That's right.
You know.
So that's always. But now you're from Australia. I'm just curious. Is anything aside from brewing Foster's beer? Is there anything over there
Unfortunately, we're as much of a bubble economy as this part of the planet is. So the main way to buy housing and real estate, watch it go up and have debt driving it behind there and think you're a genius.
So this financialization of the global economy is something that guys like Paul Krugman of the New York Times think is great because there's no such thing as debt. Debt doesn't matter.
Exactly,
interest rates can be at 0%, and there's no consequences ever. Your thoughts?
That's the deadly thing. I mean, that particular paper where he went across for the secular stagnation argument from Larry Summers, he actually said, so long as you don't build up bad consequences for the future. Now, the reality is when you take a look at what drives asset prices higher, it's rising levels of debt. And you've got to pay the debt back. You pay it back to banks, not towards other individuals. And that ultimately means this bubble has to fall over.
Let me ask you another possible fallout from low interest rates. We have an amazing degree of larceny, embezzlement, malfeasance here in the UK. This past few weeks has been the star turn of Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. They've recently been caught targeting individuals and companies for death. You talk about eugenics. I mean, here they've got the whole program in place. But isn't that a negative consequence of cheap money is that it rewards criminality? Well,
because the cheap money, I mean, I've been arguing you've had to drive rates down because I saw the debt bubble coming and said the economy can't cope with that level of debt servicing. You've got to reduce it for that reason. But the double consequence of that is these, you know, the people who are in the finance sector over here and the politicians with them, they expect to get, you know, 6 to 8% returns per annum, you know, above the rate of inflation. And if the economy is growing at less than 1%, they've got to do that in a parasitic way. And one way they can do it is by the sort of stuff you're talking about, the Royal Bank of Scotland, you know, targeting businesses, sending them under, getting their assets, selling those for a profit coming out ahead. It's parasitic behaviour of the financial sector on the real economy. And it was bad enough when the bubble was driving up. Now that the bubble's run out of the steam because of the sheer level of debt that's been accumulated, it truly can be parasitic behaviour.
It sounds like communism, the old days where we had to generate a certain number of tractors, comrade. Or the poor must be fed, the wheat harvest must be higher, said Mao. And as a result, they introduced pogroms that were slaughtered people to meet their targets. Or statistically, on a milder basis here in the UK, to meet certain educational standards, they have targets for testing and things like this, which ends up de-educating or making the population, you know, dumb, and then Boris Johnson will come along and say, well, you're dumb and that's why you're poor, and then they'll take more money. But this targeting of economic numbers and then making their assumptions fit the targets has no bearing on the real economy, correct?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I'm a fan of the innovative side of capitalism. I'm also somebody who said that innovative side can lead to crises and catastrophes occasionally. You've got to balance it with the state sector to some degree. But the thing that I find infuriating is what I call the bureau-crazies. And these people, not the bureaucracy, bureau-crazy. And you get the points targets and the objectives they set and so on, and they end up stifling the innovative side of capitalism while not giving you the sort of balancing you'd want the state to do at the same time. And I see these bureau-crazies running universities these days and degrading innovative research because they can't handle people that don't fit inside their boxes. You see it with targeting of education, and it really does feel like you've actually got, you know, Chairman Mao in control or Joseph Stalin supposedly being champions of capitalism.
Now, let's talk about this idea you just mentioned, a mixed economy or a balanced economy, or having the state involved economically at some times or some sectors, and having private markets and private enterprise involved really in a more balanced way. It seems that this is a really difficult balance to strike because of the ideological forces on both sides.
Exactly.
At some point, the statists own the megaphone, they own the media, and they broadcast their message of state control. And sometimes it becomes, in the U.S. and at times, is free markets rule above and beyond the anarcho-capitalists. You know, they have that group of ideological stalwarts. Is there an example that you can give of a balanced economy, either in history or in the current global economy, or is it a balance that's just too of a utopian vision that we really can never expect to ever happen?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that I think you could say America in the 50s and 60s had that sort of balance, but a lot of that was paranoia about the Russians. And that paranoia about the Russians meant two things. First of all, the huge arms expenditure they did, which then gave, you know, tremendous boost to innovation in American capitalism as well. But you also had them, they couldn't let the workers' wages fall too low, because if workers' wages were too low, Russia would start to look attractive, you know, the ideology of Russia.
That's a very interesting point, Steve Keen. So you're saying that, because during the 30s, of course, in the United States, a lot of people emigrated to Russia. And there was communism was a factor in U.S. politics, and you had Joseph McCarthy and other people politically rise up, and there was a whole effort to deal with communism, you know, on American soil. But the wages at that time and the promise of socialism and communism was attractive to force people to other countries. Today in America, the wages here in the UK are virtually at a complete standstill. They haven't grown at all, really, for decades. And purchasing power is collapsing. They get no return on savings. But there's no country to go to, because every single country in the world is guided by some central bank. So they're all the countries in the world have now adopted this psycho, Paul Krugman-esque, print money till you die, debt is great, wages are terrible. And but wouldn't it make sense, how do you get around the blunt force trauma of a pro-statist argument that, in fact, minimum wage and wages need to go up?
Oh, well, I mean, I've got to come out in Paul Krugman's defence here. He's saying he wants wages to rise in America as well. And I think capitalism of the 50s and 60s was, you know, post-Fordist capitalism, where Ford actually bumped up the wages he paid to his workers so that they could afford to buy the cars they were producing on the production line. And you had this belief that both profits and wages had to rise over time. And that's healthy capitalism. But we've gone across to this predatory capitalism where, you know, firms try to relocate their production to cheap wages, and they try to sell back to high-wage countries. Does not work. It works for the individual firm, but it brings down the wage levels over there.
So let me ask you this. A very simple graphic here. We got a couple minutes left. Here's the central bank, and the money is being printed, and it flows off the central bank like the water coming from the source of the Nile. And it can go in one of two places or both places. It can go toward banks to speculate. It can go toward workers in the form of wages. These days, due to financial engineering, there seems to have been an irrigation project where it only goes to speculators who get the cheap money, and it doesn't go to workers. So my question is this. The solution is either A, allow wages to rise in some commensurate ratio to the money supply that's going to bankers, or B, you must raise interest rates to get rid of those zombie banks. But we have instead the worst possible situation where the zombie banks get the cheap money and workers get nothing. Isn't that the worst of all possible worlds?
It's the worst of all possible worlds. I mean, there was, the way the reserve has set up its money goes to the banks, it goes to the reserves. they don't give the money to the public. But there was a section, and I mean was, section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act that allowed them to give money to the workers directly, which would be part of what I call a modern Jubilee structure. And that was abolished by the banks with the what's the new act called? Not the one that sort of brought back parts of Glass-Steagall. That's how it was portrayed. But a specific part of the legislation got rid of the capacity, the Federal Reserve, to actually give the money to the public, and the banks lobbied for that.
So was it one of these recent, like Dodd-Frank?
Yeah, Dodd-Frank. That was hidden in the subtext of that. They got rid of that particular section of the Federal Reserve.
It.
They abolished it.
Section what?
Section 13.3.
They
got rid of it. That
gave who the right to what?
They gave the Federal Reserve the right, with a majority vote, to direct the money to the public rather than to the banks.
They had that right.
They had that right, and they abolished it under Dodd-Frank.
Even though now, obviously, and so in other words, they got rid of Glass-Steagall. They made casino speculating legal under Commodity Futures Modernization Act.
Yeah.
And here they abolished another function of the Fed.
That could have let them do something good, what you're talking about.
What a bunch of shysters.
I know.
This is quite revealing.
Yeah, we're still, the political financial complex dominates it. We've got to get rid of them.
Well, so what are you doing here in the UK anyway? We got about 20 seconds.
Talking to a whole bunch of rebel students, rebels in Oxford, rebels in Manchester, and meeting up with Terry Jones and talking about a documentary he's doing.
Monty Python?
He had a great dinner last night. He's producing a documentary.
Are you in the reunion concert?
Oh, I'd love to, but I'm afraid
I
can't stand spam.
Oh, fair enough. All right, Steve Keen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Delighted, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Steve Keen of DebtDeflation.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.